Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me in this MMT Summer School. My name is Fadhel Kaboub. I teach economics at Denison University, and I run the Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. And it's my pleasure today to bring this presentation to you, MMT Insights for the Global South, Sovereignty, Resilience, and Sustainable Prosperity. So without any further ado, we'll get started with the main outline here, with the main points. So starting with a brief overview of what developing countries typically struggle with. Point number one, structural trade deficits, and I'll show you some data in a few minutes to illustrate this point, which leads to high levels of external debt, that is debt denominated in foreign currencies. And when you look at the major root causes of this problem, you typically identify that these are related to energy deficits. Most developing countries import their energy, mostly fossil fuels. And this is, by the way, true even for the biggest oil producers, because they export crude oil and then they import gasoline, kerosene, and petrochemicals that they need to run their economies. Number two, food deficits. The lack of food security, lack of food sovereignty is a major cause for this external debt. And then finally, the low value added content of the type of industrialization that most developing countries specialize in. And when you have these structural trade deficits, they systematically apply downward pressure on the country's currency. So you have currency devaluation, currency depreciation, which immediately makes food imports and fuel imports more expensive. And that's the inflation pass-through effect that developing countries struggle with. And if there is no intervention to artificially stabilize the exchange rate, this can, in many cases, immediately translate into social unrest, food riots. Otherwise, most developing countries, what they do, you end up with the central bank or the Ministry of Finance borrowing dollars or euros or British pounds in order to stabilize the exchange rate, in order to provide food and fuel subsidies to essentially finance that external imbalance. And these are, as I will argue later, are band-aid solutions. They don't address the root causes of that inflation problem of the external debt, but they simply apply temporary measures to stabilize the exchange rate and as a result accumulate even more external debt over the long term. So a brief recap of the economic development story of most countries in the global south. Typically post-independence, you have state-led economic development. And this was the period of the 1950s and 60s. And it was essentially supplemented by a strategy of import substitution industrialization. That is to say that most developing countries started their industrialization by replacing items that used to be imported from the global north, essentially, and started manufacturing those items locally. The problem with most import substitution industrialization, it was done under the guise of protectionism with no strings attached. In other words, industries were protected, accumulated monopolistic power, in many cases was tied to corruption and the oligarchy and a rise of an elite business class that had no incentive to innovate, no incentive to improve productivity, to invest in technological innovation or anything, or to provide better services to their customers. It was an opportunity to accumulate a massive amount of economic power with no competition. And when those economies opened up to international trade in the 70s and 80s, there was no basis to compete with companies in the global north and so on. So the period of the 1970s, the period of export-led growth, was the period of the beginning of that opening. And as you'll see from the data later, as soon as those economies open to international trade, you see a massive increase in trade deficit, actually, which led to the debt crisis of the 1980s, the so-called lost decade for most developing countries. And it was followed immediately by the structural adjustment programs introduced by the World Bank and the IMF, the neoliberal reforms of the 90s, privatization of state-owned enterprises, and the whole neoliberal era that essentially dominates to this day. I'll give you an example of Tunisia, my own home country. You'll notice there 1972 was the introduction of the free trade era in Tunisia that started to encourage export-oriented companies to grow and give them exclusive privileges and so on. As soon as Tunisia did that, you notice that the trade deficit started to accumulate massively to this day. And this is structural because in order to accelerate exports, if you are not an industrialized country like Tunisia, like most African countries, you end up importing capital equipment, you end up importing technology, intermediate goods, and you end up using low-cost labor, racing to the bottom, competing with other developing countries in order to specialize in an assembly line type of manufacturing industry. And as a result, the faster you try to accelerate your exports, the more you end up importing, including, by the way, importing energy to fuel the industrial development. And that becomes a long-term structural trap. The flip side of this picture of trade deficits is the accumulation of external debt over time, which is unsustainable because these are debts denominated in foreign currencies that a country cannot finance internally. It must earn those dollars somehow. I'll give you an example of Ghana here, and I can show you dozens and dozens of developing countries. When you look at the difference between what Ghana exports, mostly raw materials, low value added content, and then you compare it to what a country like Ghana imports, mostly higher value added content. And Ghana is not the worst and the worst scenario here because it just so happens that its exports are large enough to more or less offset most of its imports. But many developing countries, the gap between exports and imports is not only structural, but extremely painful. And as a result, translates into a rising level of external debt. This is Ghana's external debt in the last decade, skyrocketing. And the flip side of an external debt that's accumulating and rising, and as a result, the debt service rising, you have this constant pressure on the exchange rate, despite massive efforts to generate foreign currency reserves, massive efforts to borrow even more dollars to combat this depreciation. And the translation of this depreciation means higher cost of imports for food, for energy, for medicine, for basic necessities. And most of that burden is on the most vulnerable people in the economy. So the neoliberal economic model that dominates the process of economic development is based on austerity. And I'll show you a specific example in a bit. Debt restructuring, privatization of state-owned enterprises. The problem with privatization of state-owned companies is that you can only privatize the water company once. You can only privatize the airport once. You can only privatize the telecom company once. You can't use this as a constant policy to generate dollar revenues to plug the holes in your trade deficit. And most of these policies have been used. Labor market flexibility. This is a coded term that you see in a lot of World Bank documents. Essentially get rid of labor unions, weaken employment security laws and so on to open the floodgates for hiring and firing, so to speak, and make your labor market more flexible, as a result, more attractive for business. Foreign direct investment and export-led growth. As I said earlier, the problem with export-led growth and foreign direct investment is that you end up specializing in low value added content manufacturing. And the more you accelerate your exports, the more imports you have to bring in of capital, intermediate goods, and energy to fuel your economy. With FDI, it's even worse because the profits from those industries are repatriated typically to the global north. Financial liberalization. You end up essentially conducting monetary policy to attract foreign investors to come into your financial markets. And when you do that artificially with an inherently weak economy, you end up attracting primarily speculators. You attract what we call hot money. Lots of investment comes in, your stock market goes up, your foreign currency reserves increase, the government starts spending even more. And at the earliest sign of potential inflation or currency depreciation, you see a massive capital flow, which means a stock market crash, which means a currency crisis. And typically countries take them 10 years sometimes to recover from these speculative crises. Tourism is really a tricky thing here because most developing countries rely heavily on tourism. This is pre-COVID, obviously, to generate foreign currency reserves and to create jobs. But it turns out that the more tourism you bring into the country, the more food you have to import, the more energy you have to import to heat and cool the hotels, to transport tourists, to feed tourists. So the more you do tourism, the more structural trade deficit you generate. And especially that most developing countries are competing with other developing countries in tourism. So it's a constant race to the bottom with government subsidizing the travel and hotel industry with fuel subsidies, food subsidies, and so on. Now, that is not to say that we should end all tourism, but the type of tourism that we're talking about here is economically unsustainable, ecologically unsustainable, and I'll come back to this later. Remittances. Many developing countries rely on remittances from their expats, sending money back home. That's not a long-term structural solution to what we're talking about here because of the substantial brain drain that most developing countries struggle with. So it's a constant race to the bottom that ultimately produces higher and higher levels of external debt. And we're told from this mainstream neoliberal model that there is no alternative. You have to follow these fiscal discipline measures and kind of fight your way out of this vicious cycle somehow. And it's a trap, as I mentioned earlier. So for me, the only way out, and this is the MMT perspective, is to focus on the root causes of these problems. And the solutions must be focused on renewable energy investments, sustainable agriculture, because if the major root causes of this external debt are related to energy imports and food imports, you have to start there. You can't run an economy without food. You can't run an economy without energy. These are fundamental starting points, fundamental pillars for any development strategy. For many countries, because of climate change, because of neglect for decades, water and energy management, conservation policies are critical. And then on the international stage, and I'll have a whole section in a few minutes on South-South trade policies are extremely important for strategic cooperation in the global South. Because we're sold this free trade model based on the idea that competition is healthy and is good. And sometimes you hear these comparisons or references to sports. In sports, we know competition is healthy. It makes you better and stronger and all that. But if you think of a boxing metaphor, we never allow a heavyweight boxing champion to compete with a lightweight boxing champion. It's illegal, it's ugly, nobody wants to watch it. And yet, when it comes to international trade, we allow a heavyweight boxing champion like the United States, like the EU, to compete with a lightweight economy in the global South. And we call it fair, and we call it free trade, and we call it competition. So competition, yes, amongst equal, for particular strategic reasons, but not this open-ended free trade model that's been destructive in the global South. Also, strategic focus on value-added driven industrial policies as opposed to anything goes, any industry is good. And here, governments in the global south are partly to blame for this because they focus on short-term solutions. Yes, when you bring a foreign direct investment to a country, you open a factory, you employ 500 people, you're supporting 500 families. It looks good as an immediate band-aid solution. But in the long run, what you're doing is you're specializing in low value added content, and FDI profits are repatriated anyway. There is very little reinvested in the same country. So you're getting yourself into a long-term trap, even though it appears like a short-term immediate remedy to unemployment and lack of foreign currency reserves and so on. So for me and for many people in the MMT community, a job guarantee program, and I believe other colleagues will be speaking specifically about the job guarantee program in this summer school, so I will not go into detail, but a job guarantee program can be used as a platform for strategic investments where you're directing employment in strategic areas to build resilience. So I often talk about employment-led growth focused on building productive capacity in strategic areas, especially food, energy, and other strategic areas. Can we afford it? How are we going to pay for it? The typical response is that this is going to be inflationary. Developing countries can't afford to spend more on employment programs, on industrial policy, on food policy. Where will the money come from? So this is where MMT comes in. So I'll do a brief introduction to MMT, and I'm sure other colleagues have already presented in more detail on this. But very brief overview on MMT perspective in general, and then we'll do a quick zoom in on developing countries and how these insights apply in developing countries. So MMT, as you know, focuses the analysis on what we call the spectrum of monetary sovereignty. That is to say that not all countries have the same degree of monetary sovereignty. In other words, not all countries have the same spending capacity. Some countries, as you can see here, have high degrees of monetary sovereignty. Think of the US, Japan, Canada, the UK, and so on. And some countries on the other extreme end of the spectrum have absolutely no monetary sovereignty whatsoever. These would be countries like Ecuador, for example, that completely dollarize their economy and literally use a foreign currency. Most countries within the Eurozone also have given up their monetary sovereignty. But most countries in the global south are somewhere in between on the spectrum. And what determines where you stand on that spectrum is, to some extent, the level of external debt that you have and how desperate you are as a country to fix your exchange rate and to defend that exchange rate with the US dollar or with the euro or the British pound. Because once you're committed to fixing your exchange rate or defending your exchange rate, then you're essentially refocusing your entire economic policy to meet that commitment. Otherwise, the consequences, as I mentioned earlier, are severe in terms of inflation pass-through effect and currency depreciation and so on. And once you commit to that, then you have to do whatever it takes to meet that commitment, to stabilize your exchange rate. And that includes doing whatever the IMF tells you need to do. Privatize state-owned enterprises, raise interest rates, fight labor unions, rewrite your constitution to accommodate the needs of foreign investors and so on. And that means you lose monetary sovereignty, you lose economic sovereignty. So monetary sovereignty is not something that you decree. It's something that you acquire. It's something that you earn through strategic investments. And that is really the goal here, is for developing countries in the global south to identify key strategies that allow them to move from this end of the spectrum over time to higher and higher and higher degrees of monetary sovereignty. And the higher the degree of monetary sovereignty you have, the more spending capacity, the more autonomy a country will have. And when you have autonomy and resilience to external shocks, you can walk away from a negotiation table without having to throw your people under the bus without having your people starve and your economy be strangled. But when you have no monetary sovereignty or very little monetary sovereignty, you have no choice, you have no autonomy, you have no strategic vision to implement for your own country, because you're dependent on external mandates from the IMF or other lending institutions. So that's the beginning point. So monetary sovereignty, to be very specific here, a country with a high degree of monetary sovereignty is a country that issues its own currency, collects taxes in the same national currency, and most importantly, it's a country that only issues bonds denominated in the same national currency. In other words, no external debt. So once you start accumulating external debt, you start losing a certain degree of your monetary sovereignty. And when you do that, once you accumulate external debt, then you're under pressure to stabilize your exchange rate because of the inflation pass-through effects, which is why here, number 4, a country with a high degree of monetary sovereignty is a country that can afford to operate under a flexible exchange rate regime. So in other words, the countries that don't have this level of monetary sovereignty that I'm describing here are typically countries that issue a lot of external debt and are desperate to stabilize their exchange rate because of the issues that I described earlier. And the main thing that will liberate a country from having to so desperately fix their exchange rate and so desperately borrow dollars and euros is to address the root causes of that external debt, which is, as I highlighted earlier, starts with food security and energy security and strategic investments that will allow a country over time to move to higher and higher value-added content in terms of manufacturing. An important distinction here, obviously, is between currency issuers and currency users. So sovereign governments are currency issuers. You and I are currency users. In order to spend, we have to earn an income or borrow it from somebody. And as a result, that debt that we accumulate becomes a real burden on us, currency users. And if you're a developing country and you borrow in a foreign currency, you become a currency user. And as a result, that external debt becomes a real financial burden that must be paid at some point in the future, and so on. So don't try this at home. You know, this high degree of monetary sovereignty that I described here is for sovereign currency issuers, not currency users. So the main focus then becomes inflation. So MMT is not saying spending is unlimited, even for a country like the US or Japan with high degrees of monetary sovereignty. MMT is saying we reject the mainstream idea, which says that governments are limited in terms of how much they can spend by the level of taxes they can collect and the amount of borrowing they can generate from private markets. MMT is saying there's this additional spending capacity, this bright yellow space that we're not tapping into. And that additional spending capacity is not infinite. It's not unlimited. As you can see, it's constrained. It's limited by the risk of inflation, this red bar right here. So the focus then becomes what determines the risk of inflation. And from an MMT perspective, the risk of inflation is determined by, number 1, a shortage of productive capacity. In other words, if we run out of physical resources, skilled labor, material, technology, and the government continues to spend, then yes, it will cause inflation. But this also means that this is something you can address with strategic investments, with industrial policies, with agricultural policies, with energy policies. You can direct strategic investments to increase productive capacity in areas that are lacking. And when you do that successfully, you're essentially pushing that risk of inflation further and further out and expanding that additional spending capacity. The second source of inflation or inflation risk is what I call abusive price setting behavior, market concentration, when you have key players in the economy who can raise prices simply because they can. Think of energy companies, think of, in some cases, pharmaceutical companies, financial institutions, telecom companies who have oligopoly or monopoly power in some cases and can, as a result, push the risk of inflation higher. That kind of risk of inflation cannot be eliminated by austerity. It can only be eliminated when you tax and regulate their market power out of existence. In other words, you have to have commitment from your elected officials to use their power, which is the power to regulate, the power to tax, in order to democratize those markets, make them more competitive. And if you successfully do this, if you increase productive capacity in key areas where there are shortages, and if you tax and regulate abusive market power out of existence, then you're literally expanding that additional spending capacity, and as a result, pushing the risk of inflation. So you can have more government spending without bumping against the inflation barrier. And that's really the main framework for development strategy in the global South, is to start building productive capacity in key areas and tackle corruption, tackle abusive market power. And that becomes a democratic process. This is not, I'm not saying that this is easy or this can be done tomorrow, but without a clear vision about what are the true obstacles that we're facing, we'll be spinning our wheels in the same kind of neoliberal paradigm. So to me, this is a paradigm shift in terms of how we address the process of economic development. So as a result, MMT focuses on decoupling at the national level, decoupling spending and taxing. Spend on national priorities, strategic investments, health, education, food security, energy security, whatever the priorities happen to be for each country. And then tax pollution to decarbonize, tax speculation to reduce speculation, tax extreme wealth to reduce inequality, not because you need their money or their permission to fund strategic investments. Tax to protect democracy from the abusive power of the oligarchy. Tax to reduce excessive wealth, abusive market power. These are the goals of taxation. So unlike households, unlike individual currency users, the national government, sovereign government, doesn't need tax revenues in order to spend. So spend on priorities, tax for other strategic reasons. So we're not saying don't tax or support the oligarchy. If anything, tax the hell out of them, tax them out of existence, but not because you need their money or their permission, but because it's very important for reasons that I described here. So more focus on inflation. I'm going to really push us a little bit to understand the process of inflation from an MMT perspective, because that's ultimately the barrier that we're facing. Point number one, stop listening to mainstream economists. This is the Fed essentially saying we have no reliable theory of inflation. Translation in plain English, we have no idea what causes inflation. This is the ECB, inflation forecast versus actual inflation. It's not even funny. There's no connection between what the ECB, what mainstream economists think causes inflation, and what actual inflation looks like. So to be more careful with our understanding of inflation, focus on specific inflation pressure points. And as I highlighted, for most developing countries, it starts with food. It starts with energy. I'll give you an example. Tunisia is a big importer of wheat. Egypt is the biggest importer of wheat in the world. The price of wheat is not controlled by the government of Egypt, by supply and demand in Egypt. These are prices determined globally. If anything, the key players would be Australia, Russia, the Ukraine, the US. So if the source of inflation is food imports related to wheat imports, for example, or energy imports, fossil fuel imports, how is it that a central bank in a country like Egypt or Tunisia can actually target inflation effectively or fight inflation when inflation root causes are determined by Russia or the Ukraine or OPEC? It's way outside your jurisdiction. There is no way that your central bank inflation targeting policy can be effective. So focus on the sources of inflation, and the only way to build resilience against that imported inflation effect, the inflation pass-through effect, is by investing in food security, investing in renewable energy security so that no matter what happens to oil prices, no matter what happens to global wheat prices, you have your domestic resilience, and those price fluctuations globally have very little impact on your inflation rates and on your economic security. Number three, focus on the low value added content of industrialization and start to escape that trap. In some countries, the sources of inflation may be related to housing or healthcare or banking and finance. It may be related to cross-border trafficking, which is the case in Zimbabwe and many developing countries. Corruption is critical. Capital controls are key tools for managing inflation. I'll emphasize corruption here because it relates to the exclusive power and privileges that exporters have in developing countries and importers also have. If you're a country that imports all of its medical equipment, all of its food, all of its energy, typically most developing countries would have import licenses, exclusive import licenses given to key individuals, sometimes related to the government in power or to the king or to the prime minister, which means corruption. And those individuals have monopoly power and as a result have price setting power in the economy. And those will be the first people to object to a food security strategy, because food security means they lose their exclusive privilege to import food. Energy security domestically means they lose their exclusive privilege to be the only entity that can import fuel for the country. So these are the real obstacles to progress. If you're investing in domestic production of anything, it becomes a conflict with their own interest as the exclusive importers of whatever thing you're trying to produce domestically. So these are real problems that must be addressed through a democratic process, because this is a corruption system that is deeply embedded in many developing countries. Let's see. So I wanted to introduce this idea and see what you think about it. Increase government spending to fight inflation. This seems completely counterintuitive from a mainstream perspective. If anything, they tell you to reduce inflation, you need to reduce government spending. Well, let's see the MMT insight here. Again, from a mainstream perspective, this cannot be, a strategy. So I'll give you the first scenario, the mainstream approach to understanding inflation. And I'm using Tunisia here, my home country, as an example. So if Tunisia spends 2 billion dinars on, say, health and education, very important areas, obviously, especially during COVID and so on. What's going to happen if we spend 2 billion dinars, national currency, this is not foreign currency spending, the sovereign currency issuer can spend 2 billion dinars on health and education. Naturally, you're employing more people in health and education. There's going to be more food imports, more energy imports, more medical equipment imports, more laptops being imported. And as a result, you're going to have a larger trade deficit. A larger trade deficit applies downward pressure on your exchange rate. You have an inflation pass-through effect, possibly even hyperinflation if this continues, via a vicious cycle. More external debt. The IMF steps in, international lenders step in, credit rating agencies step in, and they mandate spending cuts and austerity, which means we're back to square one. You cut spending on health, you cut spending on education, and you have more unemployment, more brain drain, more social and economic and political tensions. That is the idea. There is no alternative to austerity. This is what Margaret Thatcher told us from the 1980s. So that's scenario number one. The mainstream tells you there's no escaping austerity. You can't just print money and spend it on health and education. It's going to create a disaster. Scenario number two, the MMT approach. What if Tunisia spends 1 billion dinars on health and education instead of 2, and then you spend 1 billion on increasing domestic productive capacity of food, renewable energy, energy efficiency. You crack down on abusive price setters, importers of luxury goods, corruption, and you use your power of taxation and regulation to do this. What's going to happen if you apply this strategically? You're going to have fewer imports of food and energy. You're going to have a lower trade deficit. You're going to have stable, maybe even stronger exchange rate. You're going to have no pass-through inflation effect. You're going to have lower external debt, higher credit ratings, increase in foreign currency reserves, more resilience to external shocks because you have food and energy security. You lower your carbon footprint. You have more employment, less brain drain, and improved quality of life for everyone. Now we're talking. Instead of going into an austerity vicious cycle, now we're talking about this same $2 billion worth of spending, but applied differently, doesn't produce all the negative effects, doesn't produce the vicious cycle, it produces a virtuous cycle. And once you discover the proper mechanisms to apply this strategically, then you go from 2 billion to 5 billion strategic investments to 10 billion, whatever that amount is, as long as you have the productive capacity, the logistical capacity, the organizational capacity to actually manage the additional spending. And that starts to increase your fiscal policy space and starts to get you out of that external debt trap, the inflationary cycle that I described earlier. So it's critical here that you identify the sources of inflation pressure points and you start to mitigate those by increasing productive capacity and by taxing and regulating the abusive power, the corruption mechanisms that actually trap you in that situation. So, and then finally, I'll close with a focus on the importance of South-South strategic partnerships to escape the free trade model a la neoliberal, WTO system that we've lived under over the last 3 or 4 decades. South-South strategic partnerships are extremely important for small developing countries in particular, because you can't really have economies of scale in any system of industrialization when you have a market of 10 million consumers or 5 million consumers. But when you have a large trading bloc, you have access to 200 million consumers, now economies of scale can kick in. So that's point number one. Focus on complementary resources and capabilities within a regional trading bloc of developing countries who can complement each other in a strategic way. Once you have that larger industrial base, you can start to produce horizontal linkages within your industrial system in order to increase the value-added content of what you manufacture. So instead of working as an assembly line for the global north, you create a regional trading bloc and a strategic industrial cooperation where you can capture more of the value added within the trading bloc as a result. And then you focus on collective resilience. So not industrialization and manufacturing of anything or everything. Start with the basics. Focus on food security. Focus on renewable energy security, water security, education, training, research and development, healthcare, transportation, whatever those areas of resilience are, you start building capacity on a large scale in order to move the entire trading bloc on that higher and higher degree of resilience and economic sovereignty. So this is how a country acquires a high degree of economic and monetary sovereignty. And for many countries, it's going to be very difficult to achieve it alone. You have to have strategic partners, primarily in the global south. And if a country or a regional bloc lacks this basic level of resilience, it has no bargaining chips. It can't walk away from a negotiation table, and it will continue to lose its economic and monetary sovereignty over time. Because the more resilience you have collectively within this bloc, the more you can afford to bargain, and the more strategic your cooperation will be, even with the global north. So that is really the framework. And The ultimate goal, the big picture here for countries that are able to over time achieve higher and higher degrees of monetary sovereignty, this is the vision. Start with, as I said, food and energy security, and then you can afford to prioritize universal public services, green infrastructure, health, education, and then employment guarantee as that platform to achieve these goals with living wages and benefits for people who want to work. And there's millions of people in the global south who are unemployed and want to work. And then the third layer of this long-term strategy is for countries to be able to afford generous income support for people who cannot work or should not work for health reasons. And this is how you build sustainable prosperity for everyone in the global south. And it's not going to happen via tourism. It's not going to happen via FDI. It's not going to happen via privatization. All of these strategies that I described earlier are essentially traps. So these are the long-term goals. And just imagine the possibilities of jobs that can be created in areas of food and energy and local cultural heritage preservation, indigenous and digital history, ecotourism as opposed to this traditional tourism and race to the bottom. The sky is the limit in terms of the possibilities, but it starts with strategic visions, and it starts with identifying the root causes of external debt and the key pressure points that actually produce inflation in the global south, and tackling those in the way that I described today. And with that, I'd like to thank you again for listening to this presentation. And I think we're going to have a live Q&A session. So I'm looking forward to listening to your questions and engaging in a conversation with you. And you have my contact information. Please feel free to reach out at any time. Thank you again.